Hello everyone, and welcome to the second part of Chapter 7 on Samadhi and Jhana in the context of the lecture series True Dhamma Following in the Footsteps of the Buddha. My name is Dr. Flurry, and today we will continue where we left off last time, namely with the divine jhanas. I explained pretty much the concept of all of it. I explained how those views come to be and what the benefits of those jhanas might be and what the downfalls or problems with those jhanas might be. In the last lecture, we had an overview over all the preconditions that must be necessary to attain at least the true Buddha jhanas, but also to attain all the other kinds of jhanas, because in a sense they share some similarities. So they are not completely different. That's why I like to call at least some of them, the not too ridiculous kinds, states bordering the jhanas, namely states that are somewhat similar, but not what the Buddha actually meant with jhana. Then we had a short story time, namely story time number 7, concerning the middle period of the Buddha's teachings. And now we will continue with the wrong jhanas and with the simile, how the Buddha explained the heavenly pleasures that are not yet supramundane, that are not related to insight. Yet, as written here, it can already feel 1,000 times better than sensuality. And we will continue where we left off last time. But first, as always, we will have 5 minutes of non-reactivity that are completely optional. So if you wish to have a better experience when it comes to this lecture and weaken your craving beforehand a little bit so that you can understand better, then you can now stop the video for 5 minutes and just practice yourself in emotional non-reactivity. Whatever happens, whatever urges your mind throws at you, however tricky they might be, however hidden they might be, try simply not to act out of greed, aversion and delusion for 5 minutes, and then you can continue the video. I will now pause for a moment, and afterwards you can just continue as before. Okay, I assume that you are done now, and now we come to a short simile when it comes to the divine kinds of pleasure. And remember, this is pretty much the happiness of heaven. This is virtue alone, because virtue can lead you to a rebirth in heaven, where there are exclusively good feelings. But it is not yet the Dhamma that even transcends those types of feelings and feel even better, let's put it like that. Because the most sublime kind of happiness is a complete peace that comes with Nibbana, and even heaven cannot offer that kind of peace. So this is a simile of divine pleasures. It is from the Majjhima Nikaya, number 126, I believe. And there is also a simile given for the pain or for the perils of hell. So in case you are interested, you can read that up in that sutta, which is very interesting. And those similes are very good in my opinion, because they try to convey the look and feel of those things that the Buddha is talking about. And he always said that some wise man understands the meaning of a statement given a simile. And that is very true nowadays too. From my personal experience, most people are much more willing to understand something the Buddha said when I give them an inkling with, for example, an exercise, an experiment or something like that, and not just intellectual words. That might be true, but it might not be too relatable. When I can make things relatable with a simile, then I will try to convey a difficult concept. And when it comes to pleasures that exceed the normal, then we really need something that makes it more tangible, more direct, more attainable, or something like that. But yeah, I will just read the simile to you, and then I give you a short interpretation. This will be stretched among 3 slides, because it's a rather long one, and I couldn't shorten it too much. But yeah, it begins as follows. It is hard to find a simile for the happiness of heaven. When this was said, a monk asked the Blessed One, "But, Venerable Sir, can a simile be given?" And the Buddha answered, "It can, monk." And the Blessed One said the following: "Monks, suppose that a righteous king possesses the 7 treasures and the 4 kinds of success, and because of that experiences pleasure and joy. A king is, this is the first one, handsome and graceful. He possesses the supreme beauty of complexion, and he surpasses other human beings in that regard. A king lives long and endures long, and he surpasses other human beings in that respect. A king is free from illness and affliction, possessing a good digestion that is neither too cool nor too warm, and he surpasses other human beings in that respect. And a king is dear and agreeable to nobles and householders alike, just as a father is dear and agreeable to his children. So too a king is dear and agreeable to nobles and householders." So those are the 4 kinds of success that the Buddha explained, and those things are more or less related to this direct life, to his body, and not so much towards his possessions. In the beginning of the sutta, he also listed the 7 kinds of treasures that a king possesses. I have left them out because I did not find them too relatable. You cannot really understand how much worth the elephant treasure or the horse treasure or things like that have nowadays. But he also had women and power and all the other things that come to mind when it comes to worldly pleasures. So he had all the material things that are desirable at his time, and the Buddha listed those things. And they have not changed much nowadays, to be honest, because people more or less still desire the same thing. And the important part in the simile is that the king is pretty much foremost among all those things. He lives longer than others. So in comparison, he wins that comparison and thus can derive a lot of pleasure and joy out of that. And in all the other regards too. He has pretty much everything. This is what the simile tries to convey. And then the simile continues. And Venerable Sir, a king would experience pleasure and joy because of possessing even one of those treasures, let alone all 7 treasures and 4 kinds of success. And then the Buddha took a small stone from the ground, the size of his hand, and the Blessed One addressed the monks as follows. What do you think, monks? Which is greater, this small stone that I have taken, the size of my hand, or the Himalaya, the king of the mountains? And the monks answered, Venerable Sir, the small stone that the Blessed One has taken, the size of his hand, does not count beside the Himalaya, the king of the mountain. It is not even a fraction. There is no comparison. And then the Buddha answers, so too, monks, the pleasure and joy that a king would experience because of possessing the 7 treasures and the 4 kinds of success does not count beside the happiness of heaven. It is not even a fraction. There is no comparison between the two. So what the Buddha explains here is he takes pretty much the ideal person, the person that has literally everything. And I think in the chapter on the cultural background, I compared the going forth of Buddha Gautama with famous people like Ryan Reynolds and young Arnold Schwarzenegger or Donald Trump or any kind of those very rich and very famous persons. So the king pretty much is comparable to those people. He has everything any person could ever wish for, at least when it comes to material goods and the standard human lifestyle. He has women, he has everything pretty much. And yet, the happiness of heaven, the happiness that comes through virtuous behavior, that comes through practicing, for example, the Brahma Viharas, or through practicing jhanas, even as a practitioner, as an unenlightened person, is far greater than that. There is a happiness, there is a pleasure, well, both are technically right words to describe that exceeds the happiness that those people experience on account of their material wealth by far, even to an extent that there is no comparison between the two. It is on a completely different level. And there are 2 other kinds of happiness that the Buddha described, namely the happiness of the jhanas, the temporary liberations of mind, and then the happiness of nibbana, the complete liberation of mind, where there's no falling back anymore. So there are still pleasures that exceed the heavenly pleasures. And the Buddha technically also distinguished between various different kinds of heavenly pleasures. Because in essence, there are 31 realms of rebirth in Buddhism. You can categorize them more roughly into 6 levels. There is the animal realm, as an example, the realm of hungry ghosts, the human realm, the realm of the asuras, and heaven, pretty much. And there are various different kinds of heaven. Oh, and hell is also there. Various different kinds of heaven and various different kinds of hell, as an example. And he distinguished between many of those heavens. And he correlated them with various different kinds of attainment in jhana and so on. And each of the people who might die in jhana, as an example, go to an even higher heaven that might even exceed those kinds of pleasures here. But roughly speaking, they are still on the same level most of the time, unless you also possessed supreme wisdom. Then you can even exceed this kind of pleasure. But all of this should give you an idea that there are many states of mind, many states of joy and pleasure and whatnot that can be attained way before insight even becomes something that you know about, that you experience. And the joy, the peace, and all those things that come from the experience of states of insight, of states of liberation of mind, those exceed those pleasures. So this is something that you can look forward to. But many people are not interested in that and are completely fine with just possessing, as the Buddha put it, the inferior kinds of heavenly pleasures. He even scolded his chief disciple Sariputta at one point for only teaching a Brahmin the Brahma Viharas, the heavenly pleasure, and not the insight, the right view. He said, there is still more to be done. Why did you leave? That person was clearly capable of more. But anyway, let us continue. As always, you can scan the QR code here if you want to read up the sutta in detail. I obviously just picked a selection of suttas because I cannot present all of them. All of them are, as far as I am concerned, very good and convey a very important point, and all of them more or less address the very same thing. But again, different people will find different suttas appealing to them. And thus you should just read, for example, the Pali Canon until you find something that strikes your interest, and then try to understand and read that in detail. But anyway, let us continue with Samadhi. And now we come to the very important point that this chapter is all about. Samadhi and Jhana. Samadhi is a state of coming together of various path factors. And Samadhi can be interpreted as a foreform of Jhana. It is the state that ultimately culminates in Jhana. And now we try to understand it before we come to the 5 hindrance model. And those 5 hindrances must be overcome to enter the 4 Buddha jhanas, as the Buddha described them. So we are now finished with the various different kinds of wrong jhanas. I have just presented 2 classes of, let's say, jhanas that are not what the Buddha jhanas are, but might still be beneficial in some sense, but not necessarily leading to the goal of liberation of mind. And this is very important to keep in mind. I do not say that other jhanas, or whatever people want to call jhana, is not beneficial in some way or another. What I say is that they do not lead to the liberation that the Buddha described, simply because they are not the same state. And this is a very important distinction that you should keep in mind. If you are a person who wants to attain Nibbana, who wants to reach final liberation of mind, then you should by all means practice what the Buddha explained as Samadhi and what the Buddha explained as Jhana, and not some other form of moral virtue that feels very good, but is not yet beyond feeling. This is very important to keep in mind. But yeah, what is Samadhi? There are various different kinds of definition of Samadhi. The most popular translation nowadays would be concentration of mind, and this translation comes from the background of the absorption jhanas. That's why I'm very hesitant when it comes to using that word. I still use it sometimes because most translations use it, and it's easier for people to understand what I mean. But overall, a more fitting translation would be something like composure, keeping things together or things like that, and we will understand that in detail in a few minutes. And I like to begin this slide with a citation from the Dhammapada. And it says, "There is no meditative concentration or composure for him who lacks insight, and there is no insight for him who lacks meditative concentration. He in whom are found both meditative concentration and insight indeed is close to Nibbana." This is Dhammapada verse 372. And it's a very important one, because what is said here is pretty much that you need both. You need concentration, or samatha in this case. I think it was samatha, the original translation. You need calm and you need insight. You cannot go without those things. Those things always go together. They circle around each other. They are pretty much 2 sides of the very same thing. So when people say that they practice their jhana, and it is something completely different from insight, not related to insight at all, then you, or at least I, am a bit cautious, because what they describe is very likely not what the Buddha said. The Buddha always explained it as 2 oxen pulling the same yoke. Never as, I don't know, sometimes one oxen runs in front, sometimes the other. It's always the same, at the same time. So those states cannot really be separated from each other. You pretty much always do both at once. You can emphasize calm samadhi, as an example. You can do calm samadhi and active samadhi or something like that, but it's pretty much always the same. It's just that you emphasize one of those aspects, and it's very important to keep that in mind, that those 2 things pretty much always happen at once. The Buddha, as an example, never had much of a distinction when it comes to his meditation instructions between those 2. He always pretty much prescribed the same thing. He never said that you should watch your nostrils for so and so long, then you should switch to a smile or something like that. Those would be some of the instructions that Lee Brasington likes to use, which are technically working for whatever he tries to achieve with it, but it's not what the Buddha meant. If it was so simple, if it was like that, the Buddha very likely would have just said that you just have to watch your nostrils and then you will be liberated at some point. But he never did. And I would very much assume that he would have discovered that way if it was that easy, because he literally tried everything during his time and pretty much during the time of his asceticism, when he tried to reach all those states, when he tried to strive for liberation on his own, because there was no teacher around who could teach for liberation of mind. Yeah, but again, here's a small reminder, even right Samadhi is the last part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It starts with right view, then the path begins, then the Dhamma begins, and it ends pretty much with right Samadhi. Sometimes the Noble Eightfold Path is listed with 2 additional elements that come after right Samadhi, and those are right knowledge and right liberation. So directly after attaining right Samadhi or attaining right Jhana, which is what Samadhi culminates in, you are already very close to liberation. So when you are not very close to liberation and still suffer on a very regular basis and are only free from suffering while you perform your meditation method, but would still suffer if your children die, if your parents die, if you lose a limb, if you would die, then you are not close to that kind of jhana that the Buddha was describing. And this is very important to keep in mind. I do not mean that in a negative way, and I don't want to take away your attainments in meditation or anything like that. This is not my goal. I just want to make sure that there is no misunderstanding between what you might practice and what the Buddha has taught. So his jhanas are very likely different from most of the modern methods. And this is very important to keep in mind. So the literal translation of Samadhi is keeping things together. This is the literal translation. And it's very important to keep that in mind. And what do you keep together? People are always they have a different understanding of that. Let's put it like that. But when it comes to the Buddha, what it very likely means is that you keep your point of view anchored in something that is very, very much always there, like your perception of impermanence. So when you perceive non-self or impermanence, or however you want to put it, and keep that together, make it continuous, make it be there all the time, then you are practicing Samadhi. And the Buddha was very clear on that. It is just that the people that usually translate and interpret the suttas make a distinction between various different things where there is no distinction. They do not recognize his talks on non-self, etc., and recognize that those talks are also on the same thing as all the other talks. There is no real distinction between those. So when the Buddha talks about Samadhi, it's pretty much keeping together your perception of impermanence or non-self. You try to make it continuous, try to perceive like that at all times, and as a result, at some point your mind is liberated, because that is what liberation of mind is. You unown your own mind, and as a result you cannot suffer no matter what happens with that mind, because it is no longer regarded as yours. So when that state becomes permanent, then you are liberated, then you have attained Nibbana. So many people have not understood yet that the teachings of the Buddha are all about non-self, even though literally 50% of the suttas contain the word non-self as a word non-self. When they read, for example, the teachings of dependent origination, they interpret that, what is written there, in the sense of, from the perspective of practitioner, which is perfectly normal. But they think that really your consciousness has to vanish. But that is not what the Buddha was talking about. He was talking about removing the self from the elements of the chain of dependent origination. Some of those elements will literally fade, but some of the other things will remain there. They are just not the same as before anymore. So from the point of view of an unenlightened person, those things cease completely. But from the point of view of an arahant, there is still feeling. The 5 aggregates that constitute your experience are still there. But yeah, this is just a digression, a small one. But yeah, it's also very important to keep in mind that right Samadhi is Samadhi that leads to liberation. There can be other forms of Samadhi without the right view, and those would not be right in the sense that they don't lead to liberation. But right Samadhi, in any case, depends on a sufficient development, prior development in virtue and insight. Again, Right Samadhi can only be right based on the insight of the right view. Otherwise, it is not leading to liberation. And right always designates the leading you to liberation aspect of something. And this is very important to keep in mind. And Samadhi overall, as it feels very good, or can feel very good, can be mistaken for the Brahma-viharas, or the other way around. The Brahma-viharas can be mistaken for Samadhi, which culminate in Jhana. Again, we had that before, but pretty much every nice feeling state is, from the point of view of someone who has not experienced more and has a relatively small frame of reference, the Jhana, or the Samadhi, or something like that, simply because those are the words that are closest to the description of what they experience. So when the Buddha explains something as the highest pleasure or the highest joy, and this is the highest joy that you have experienced thus far, then it's perfectly clear to you that that must be the Nibbana that the Buddha was talking about. But in essence, that is not true. There can be even higher states that you have not yet attained. This is why you should not be content too easily, because many times there is more to attain. And by the way, it's very easy for people to think that they are done, while they are not done. So it is always a good idea to just continue practicing just in case. If you are really enlightened, then the continual practice is of no harm to you and you won't mind at all. And if you mind the continued practice, then you know very well that you are not done yet. So that is very important to keep in mind. And in essence, right Samadhi, or the combination of right Samadhi in Jhana, means that there is there's not just the temporary absence of unwholesome states, there's a freedom from the unwholesome states. You have found the way out of unwholesome states, and you know how to escape them. You have understood that the unowning of those states, the removal of the self, is what means that there is the possibility of freedom in this very life. But yeah, overall, Samadhi can be developed before right view. Just to give you an idea, Samyutta Nikaya 12.61 talks about it, but it can lead to problems later on. There is let's call it a wrong positive feedback loop that can lead to people not doing anything anymore because they think that they are done. And this is very important and probably one of the most misunderstood things out there nowadays. Jhana always comes through dispassion. Any kind of liberated state of mind or of liberated state of body comes through dispassion. First disenchantment, then dispassion, then liberation. And this is usually done through the perception of first anicca, that you notice that things are unownable, they do not obey your command, they just change on their own accord. Then you experience dukkha on account of that, because what you before noticed, assumed to be under your control is no longer under your control. Thus you suffer on account of it, and then you let go. And the result is automatically non-self. You do not actively cultivate this passion. It automatically happens based on the perception of the right perception of impermanence, I should say. So yeah, this is important to keep in mind. It is possible that people discover jhana before they attain the right view, namely the understanding of the Dhamma, but it is freakishly rare because the teachings of the Buddha are still around nowadays, and it is easy to get access to them simply because of the internet, as an example. And people always first try to look for solutions to their problems in other people. Even the Buddha went out to search for other teachers in the beginning, found no one, and then started driving towards liberation on his own. So yeah, what does composure mean in more detail? Not losing your perception of non-self. It's what I like to use as a good translation. The Buddha translated it or called it oftentimes the imperturbable. No matter what happens, you are not losing that perception of non-self. You are free in that state. And, which is also very important, the state of composure is a wide and open state. It is not absorbed. And Majjhima Nikaya number 111 should be very clear on that, and should clear all doubt that the Buddha was always talking about an open state of mind. Yet, I cannot really overemphasize that, because people have very deep-rooted views when it comes to mindfulness and when it comes to jhana. But yeah, the Buddha pretty much always explained the attainment of jhana as a gradual thing. The Buddha described it as follows in chronological order. Unless he used numbers as a remembering scheme, he progressed in chronological order. He named first what you should do first, then second what you should do second, etc. And he explained the attainment of jhana in this stock phrase that occurs over and over in the entire collection of the Pali Canon. And he pretty much said, here a monk, quite secluded from sensuality. and the body is the basis of the senses. So you are essentially quite secluded from the body and secluded from unwholesome states of mind. Literally all unwholesome states of mind, not just some. When you are practicing Samadhi, there can be some unwholesome states of mind left. That is perfectly fine. But when you enter the first jhana, all the unwholesome states of mind cease. And the most unwholesome states of mind is wrong understanding, is avijja, is ignorance of the three marks. The Buddha was absolutely clear on that wrong view, namely ignorance of the three marks, is the most blameworthy and the most unwholesome thing of them all. And this citation is from Majjhima Nikaya 39, but you can literally look it up in every third sutta or something. The Buddha did use jhana as one of the main methods. And what is important here is that first there is the seclusion, and then there is freedom from unwholesome states, including wrong understanding. And those are both preconditions for attaining the state of jhana, the state of awakening. And jhana is that. Jhana is a state of temporary liberation of mind. It is a state of insight, a state of non-self. And dwelling in that state, simply because it is a temporary liberated state, will get you closer to the full liberated state. By dwelling in it, you condition, you create, let's say, the habit of being liberated, because the mind notices, oh, it is really like that, it is better like that, this is really the most sublime thing. And at one point, it depends on the person, how long it takes, your mind will be fully liberated and cannot fall back into a prior state. And it really is like training a muscle. You get good at it by doing it quite often. And this is important to keep in mind. It is a training. This is why the Buddha called it a drilling, a training, something that you strive for through manly effort, manly striving, and all the other things. And this is why he compared it so many times with tedious tasks, like using up the grip of a handle through use. Like swinging your axe at a tree over and over until the grip is used up. This is how the training in Buddhism and the Buddhist practice works. It is a gradual process. But anyway, let us continue. Just a few more words on virtue as a prerequisite, because it is so important. Again, without virtue, there is no Dhamma. The foundation for Dhamma is virtue, because virtue is pretty much practicing Dhamma without knowing that you are practicing Dhamma. But Dhamma transcends virtue. It transcends both good and bad. So this is also very important to keep in mind. And Dhamma overall begins with stream entry, and that requires virtue. And right overall is only possible after understanding what right even means. So you could explain a stream enterer or one of right view as a person who knows right is right and wrong is wrong. Leading to liberation as leading to liberation, or leading away from liberation as leading away from liberation. And this is the core insight. Once you understood that, then you are very close to liberation already. Then you have done a huge chunk of the work that is necessary to attain liberation of mind. But the Buddha overall mainly spoke to very advanced people, and thus the teachings on virtue were often either implicit and left out, or he was talking to very beginner people, and then his instructions were always pretty much the same. He was talking about the gradual training and virtue and all those things. Talk on giving, talk on receiving, the benefits of renunciation, and all those things. Those are for beginners. Those things should be performed before you have fully understood the Dhamma. They are still very beneficial afterwards, but before that they are a necessary precondition. And beginners don't give it a second thought when they read such statements. Yet, years of training are often necessary to attain the real jhanas, or to attain stream entry, which is kind of a precondition for attaining any kind of jhana. If you live and still live the life of a puthujjana, of a householder who is deeply immersed in sensual pleasures, then not even the first jhana is possible. And I say not even, but the first jhana is a state that is very lofty. It is a very, very pleasant state, full of relief and joy and everything. And it is a very good attainment of mind. But it cannot be done if you are still living the same lifestyle as before, because those go in completely opposite directions. It is like drinking alcohol to become sober. And this will not work. It is completely out of the question. Yet there are people out there who live very unrestrained lives and claim jhanas. But those jhanas cannot be what the Buddha described as jhanas because of the freedom from the unwholesome states that they are not really doing. But yeah, even Ayya Khema, and she is not teaching the, at least from my understanding, the complete Buddha jhanas, but more of a form of virtue, says that it can take 3 to 4 years of training until you can get into those states, until you can experience the heavenly pleasures. And I think her states of jhana are more akin to the heavenly pleasures. and not so much like the pleasure or the relief of insight. And now to one more picture. When it comes to the training that the Buddha described, or the Noble Eightfold Path, I have included it here in a 12 steps diagram. It first starts with the mundane right view that sets you up for the practice. Then based on that, you can accept that virtue and restraint are necessary. And at some point, after practicing rightly, the gradual training, trying to understand what Dhamma is, etc., then you have the right view. Then you have some form of stream entry, or first the attaining of the right view and then stream entry. And then the path really begins. Then the Dhamma begins. Then you have the other elements, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right mindfulness. And at the very end, shortly before liberation, you have right concentration, which includes jhana. Right concentration or right samadhi is just what culminates in jhana. Based on that, right knowledge can arise, and based on that, you can have right liberation. This is very important, and the order does matter. If you have not yet attained stream entry, you cannot really enter pretty much any of the jhanas that the Buddha described, because they are states of liberation. And when you did not have the insight that liberates you, then you cannot enter states of liberation. It is like that. There are nice feeling states, and those can be enjoyed as long as there is no craving involved. But they should not be mistaken with the temporary liberation of mind that the Buddha talked about. And you can find lots of references in the sutras on that. He often called it the temporary liberation of mind. It's not just a one-time thing that you can just discuss away. Many of the descriptions of the jhanas, if not all, are very, very similar, and they all point to the very same thing. It is just that people choose to ignore them because it does not match their preconceived notions about their jhanas and their pleasant states of mind that they have discovered or learned from someone else. Again, the best thing that you can imagine is not the best thing that is out there, that is possible. And this is very important to acknowledge. Because if you think that you are done because there is something that feels nicer than that which you have experienced before, then you make no additional effort to gain more. And now we come to the 5 hindrance model, which is also very important. And the 5 hindrances have to be overcome before you even experience the jhanas. That is a necessary precondition. So the freedom from the hindrances is a necessary condition. And again, here is a very important absence. There is a difference between the temporary absence of hindrances and freedom from the hindrances. Imagine being in a prison, and if you behave well, as an example, you can go out 2-3 hours a day, but if you behave very well, you can even be on probation. But technically, you are still imprisoned. You still can fall back into that state. It is not like being completely free and unable to go to prison ever again, but being released from prison and being able to go back there in the future. This is what true freedom is like. This is not a temporary absence. It is an inability of future arising. And this is true for the hindrances and for jhanas. And we will now analyze the 5 hindrances model in more detail to understand what it is like. And the first hindrance, and I will just go through the list in order, is lust. And lust is an old word with many double meanings, and thus many people have many preconceived notions about the word that should be avoided. You can relabel that word in many other ways. But overall, it just describes the tendency of mind of positive wanting, of wanting something more. And some relatable synonyms for the same thing might be greed, or wanting, or attraction, or desire for, or liking, or wanting, or whatever. And basically, well, it's always in relation to the body, it's always in relation to sensuality. And lust is pretty much the basis for addiction, because you always want more when you are addicted. And sensuality overall is more or less the most general addiction of them all, as we have understood, hopefully, in chapter 1. And the Buddha compared it with taking up debt to enjoy things right now. It's like borrowed jewelry. You take the jewels, borrow them from another, put them all over your body, enjoy them, and then you forget that they aren't yours. And the Buddha described being free from lust as follows. Suppose a man were to take a loan and undertake a business, and his business were to succeed, so that he would repay all of the money of the old loan, and there would remain enough extra to maintain a wife. Then, on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. This part of the simile has been used for the Buddha to describe freedom from lust, because lust is like taking up debt. Once you are free from the pressure of debt, and every person who was deeply indebted before knows how this can feel and how much relief there is in overcoming that debt. As an example, I have been a rather poor student who had to take up, well, at least for German standards, or at least for my standard at the time, a rather big loan that I had to repay. And once I had enough money to repay that loan, that was a huge relief. And that was a moment full of joy. But this kind of joy is not the immense pleasure of an orgasm or something. It is a relief. Something oppressive goes away. And this is very important to keep in mind. And this is a scheme that follows us through the entirety of all the suttas. The type of happiness the Buddha was talking about is almost always related to that kind of relief, at least when it comes to insight. But yeah, so in general, we have some now more detailed discussion when it comes to lust. First of all, we are born with a tendency to have lust. Even a newborn child has the underlying tendency towards lust. They might not be greedy at the beginning, but if nothing changes and the toddler is not taught otherwise, then they will develop the hindrance of lust automatically. It can be unlearned. That is perfectly possible through, for example, the practice of virtue and the training that the Buddha gave us. But if you change nothing at all, then that child will be a rather greedy 2-year-old that does not want to share his toys with other children. The sharing must be taught to that toddler, which is very important. And overall, it makes perfect sense. It can be an evolutionary mechanism that ensures seeking beneficial circumstances. You need food for survival, and thus it is good to look for food. So it is good to have such a greed drive or such a lust drive, because overall, we have to procreate to keep our species alive. We have to eat to keep our species alive. And so it makes sense to have that as a pre-programmed behavior. But overall, you cannot really do much about lust. The Buddha called it slightly painful, and so it's not an urgent concern of ours. You have to cultivate the perception of danger or repulsiveness in the lustful thing, but that takes a lot of insight already. You pretty much have to have the right view to even be able to see the danger. And you have to see it peripherally, as always there, as a condition. The pain is a condition for the pleasure. So the pleasure that you experience on account of sensuality or on account of giving in to lust is completely conditioned by pain that you feel before, the pain of craving. So in essence, there's only really pleasure in something if there is pain before. And you have to see that peripherally and not instead of something. So you don't want to recondition your mind to perceive pleasure as painful, but you want to see that pleasure is inseparable from pain. And you want to regard, pleasure pretty much as a poisonous drink. And the training beyond stream entry is pretty much about uprooting sensuality. And you first weaken lust in the second stage of awakening, and later you overcome it in the third stage when you become an anagami, a non-returner. First of all, the lust is still there for quite a long time after attaining the right view, if you do not act in accordance with the Dhamma and don't try to uproot sensuality. But now to the second hindrance, which is hatred. And again, hatred is an equally old word with many double meanings again. It describes the tendency of mind of negative wanting, of wanting something to go away. And again, it is also part of craving as a whole. Craving includes the 3 poisons of wanting more, wanting less, and wanting to ignore, pretty much. And relatable synonyms, just to make it easier for you to understand what it is, because again, hate is loaded with double meanings, are aversion, desiring against, disliking something, unwanting something, and it's still basically part of sensuality, because hatred is a state bound up with the body, just like lust, just like worry, just like sloth, and just like doubt even. All those states are felt in the body, and this is very important to keep in mind. And hate is just the other side of the sensuality coin. It is like a painful disease. This is what the Buddha compared it with, and it obsesses the mind. So if you feel hate right now, ill will towards something, then you cannot possibly think about something else. Your entire existence revolves around that hatred that has taken over your mind. And the Buddha did describe the freedom from hatred as follows. Suppose a man were afflicted, suffering, and very ill, and his food would not agree with him, and his body had no strength, but later he would recover from that affliction, and his food would agree with him again, and his body would regain strength. Then, on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. But again, this gladness is a type of relief, the removal of something very oppressive. So the freedom of the hindrances can best be described as the removal of something that oppresses you. And this is one of the insights that you will have upon attaining the right view, namely that all emotions, all feelings are bad. They are of an oppressive nature. They force you to act in a certain way. And over time, upon repeating that insight over and over again, your tendency to follow through with the pull of sensuality will gradually fade away as long as you do not maintain it. But again, this is very painful, by the way. Hatred is very painful. People that are full of hate are suffering immensely on account of it. If you see, for example, at your work, people who are raging all the time because of things that happen in the traffic, then they suffer much more from their rage than the other person could possibly suffer due to you honking in traffic or screaming at them or something like that. The Buddha compared it with picking up a hot coal to throw it at someone else. You burn yourself first. The other person will be barely touched by it and can't even dodge it. So that is also very important to keep in mind. And again, we are born with a tendency of hatred. The underlying tendency is there. You could call it an evolutionary or biological programming that was very helpful for avoiding harmful situations. It is necessary in an evolutionary context. When you are completely driven by desire and lust, then you need a certain programming to avoid painful situations, to avoid situations that harm the survival of your species. And you really, again, can't do much about it initially. It is very painful, yes, which means that the mind likes to deal with it very fast, to remove that. This is why we act out of hatred so fast, to make it go away, because it hurts. We choose to ignore the hurting and just act out of the craving to remove that painful feeling. But yeah, it is still very painful, even if we ignore the pain. And you have to cultivate the perception of the pain and the hatred so that the mind will no longer engage in it. And again, it has to be seen peripherally, and you should regard hatred as a disease. And again, the training beyond stream entry is also about uprooting hate. You first weaken it at the second stage of awakening, and later overcome it at the third stage of awakening. And noble friends you can imitate, as an example, can really benefit you in the process of overcoming hatred as a hindrance. And again, it is a state that is bound up with the body. And now we continue with the next hindrance, which is sloth and torpor. And you could label it laziness, mental laziness, or whatever. And we are born with it. We are born with an energy conservation drive. Energy was a scarce resource in an evolutionary context, and we still carry a lot of that programming. Again, the Buddha never talked in evolutionary terms. I use them because they are relatable to many people nowadays, and they can be used to explain the very same thing. And synonyms for sloth and torpor are muddle-mindedness, sleepiness, drowsiness, tiredness, a lack of drive, laziness, not enough energy to do anything, not enough motivation, all those things. And sloth is like a prison for the mind, which again is very important. And it prevents you from doing the things that are good for you, from which you know that they are good for you, but you still cannot do them because of the hindrance of sloth and torpor. And abandoning unwholesome leads to tireless energy, as the Buddha explained it. In one of the suttas that concerns his liberation, he even said, on abandoning some unwholesome qualities, tireless energy arose in him. And this is very important to keep in mind. And again, sloth is bound up with the body. As long as you take up the body, as long as there is ownership of the body, you can experience sloth and torpor. But when you relinquish the ownership of the body, then you are no longer tired in the mind when the body is tired. Those are two different things. But upon taking up the body as yours, your mind will completely imitate the state of the body, because on a very subtle level you think that they are the same thing, while they are not. You can relinquish the ownership of the body, and then sloth and torpor can no longer touch you, again, which is very important. And the Buddha compared it as follows in the simile. Suppose a man were imprisoned in a prison house. Later he would be released from prison, safe and secure, with no loss to his property. Then, on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. Again, from Majjhima Nikaya number 39, where the Buddha goes in detail through all the hindrances and the jhanas. So if you want to read it up, you can go there. It is probably one of the most relatable and detailed descriptions of the jhanas. And again, this is a type of relief. You are no longer oppressed by the prison. Suddenly you can do whatever you wish. And the same is true when sloth and torpor are gone. You are suddenly able to do whatever you wish, because you are no longer imprisoned in your mind. You are no longer confined by your sloth and torpor. And suddenly you can go to work if you wish. You can exercise if you wish. You can do all those things. You are no longer limited by sloth and torpor, which is very liberating. But again, it is a relief. It is not orgasmic pleasure. And yeah, what can really help to deal with sloth is a modularized plan with small rewards all along the way. So it's essentially the tips and tricks that people use when it comes to self-improvement. When they have lacking motivation, then they must help themselves with such things. The Buddha also explained that you can look at a bright light and you should not overeat. In essence, there is a sutta where Mahamoggallana is trying to attain liberation. And I think it is linked there in the Book of the Sevens, number 61, and it is called dosing. And the Buddha gives Mahamoggallana all kinds of tips to overcome sloth and tiredness and all those things. So if you want to have a detailed look, you can go there. And what can also help is to spend lots of time outside in wind and weather, because it makes you awake. Because in such situations, wakefulness was necessary, and our biological programming, if you want to tackle it from that angle, will arouse energy in such situations. Energy will only be there when you need energy. The mind will only provide us with what we need, just like the body will only provide us with what we need. The body will only make muscles grow when you give it a reason to grow muscles. And it will only provide you with energy when you need the energy. When your lifestyle requires no energy, then sloth will be the natural result. But when you slowly and gradually adopt a lifestyle that requires energy, then you will be fit for striving. Just as the Buddha explained in the simile of the walking meditation, and the citation of the walking meditation, and how it makes you suitable for striving. Simply because you need the energy suddenly. And then the mind will provide the energy. And then it will become easier and easier over time to provide more energy. What can also help is to do walking or standing meditation instead of sitting, because those states require more energy. And you should also get enough sleep and rest in case you are missing in that area. But yeah, overall, sloth is not really related to any of the states of awakening, but it's very related to jhana. So you must overcome sloth to enter jhana. And it must be a freedom from sloth, not a temporary absence. This is also very important. So when you can still be tired in the mind, as an example, then it's a good sign that sloth is not overcome. Then you have not completely unowned sloth. So the next one is worry. And it is kind of a counterpart to sloth. And again, it is an innate tendency of mind. From an evolutionary perspective, and I really like to use the evolutionary perspective because it's very relatable nowadays. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense to constantly simulate possible future scenarios in the mind, to be prepared. Because the worst thing that can happen is that something untrained or unknown happens, and then we will die on account of that. And then our species will not survive, and that is obviously a problem. So we try to avoid that at all times, and thus a huge part of our mind is constantly busy with worrying and simulating possible future scenarios. I think most people know that. When they are under the shower, they are standing there, and then they are trying to go through imaginary scenarios that might happen one day, but probably never will happen. And synonyms are agitation, restlessness, worry about the future, remorse about the past, an inability to calm down, or too much energy. And worry is like being a slave, because your entire striving is pretty much dictated by that worry. The worry says what you must do, and you are just standing there, yes, I will worry about that. And you give away your freedom for a dream of safety that can probably never be attained, because nothing in samsara is really safe. The only safe haven that can be attained is nibbana. So you should strive for that and not for some kind of circumstantial freedom from worry, as an example. And you can't be too calm and too agitated at the same time. And oftentimes our worry is rooted in immoral behavior, because that produces lots of remorse. And remorse is some prime source of worry. So whenever you stop behaving in a way that produces remorse, then a lot of the worry will already leave us. But again, some existential anxiety will pretty much always remain until we have found the way out of suffering. Until then, we will worry about death, because death can ultimately touch us. But when we have attained the right view, then there is only a, let's say, limited amount of death left for us. But yeah, it's a subtle drive to avoid boredom, which is also something, a way that you could phrase it. Because when there is boredom, sooner or later the existential dread will surface. Because it always lurks there in the background. And the only thing that makes it stay away for an unenlightened person is that we distract ourselves. And when we are bored, we are not distracted, and that is a problem. And the Buddha used the following simile. Suppose a man were a slave, not self-dependent, but dependent on others, unable to go where he wants. Later he would be freed from slavery, self-dependent, independent of others, a freed man able to go where he wants. Then, on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. Again, this is a type of relief. You are free from something oppressive. You are no longer a slave. Again, the worry in your mind is dictating your entire striving. If there is worry, you will do everything that is possible to make that worry go away. You will behave exactly like that worry tells you to. You have not yet unowned that worry and just allow it to be there in the mind without being affected by it. That is something that you must do to overcome the hindrance of worry. And again, to overcome worry, you have to try and behave virtuously. Too much property and too much clinging will also lead to worry and to restlessness. This is very clear. People who own a lot and are very attached to their property will worry all the time about their property. So the less you own, the happier or the less burdened you are by your ownership. You should, as a result, cultivate fewness of desires, because those desires are what make you worry. And you should try to let the restlessness just endure in the mind without you being touched by it. It is a state bound up with the body. It is just that your mind automatically emulates that state of the body, and thus it becomes agitated too when the body is agitated. And it can also help to cultivate thankfulness and practice Dhamma, because all those things, in essence, follow the law of the Dhamma, the natural principle of giving things away. And by relinquishing the ownership of things, there is fewness of desire as a natural result. You should also spend time with good people, because you will emulate their behavior, become more like them. And as a result, when they are good people, you will do all the things that I have already described. And you should also avoid news and politics and agitated people, because again, the imitation works in both ways. And we will not just imitate people, we will also imitate online sources, social media, and such things. So it's always good to avoid social media. In essence, create an environment where there are not so many negative impulses that pressure and burden you. But yeah, let us continue. The last hindrance is the hindrance of doubt. And this one is very much related to the path, to the Dhamma, because overcoming doubt is the moment where you become a stream enterer. And this should also eradicate all doubt that you can attain jhana, realistically speaking, without attaining stream entry. Because you must overcome doubt to enter jhana. And to overcome doubt, you have to be a stream enterer. You have to attain right view. You must go beyond doubt, to a place where doubt no longer can touch you. And this is very important to keep in mind. And this should make it plainly obvious why the Buddha jhanas are something different from what most people interpret as jhanas. And overcoming doubt confirms your faith, because at that moment you understand completely what the Buddha meant with going beyond doubt. And doubt can happen on all levels. It can be subtle, it can be strong, it can be all kinds of things. And it is a mix of mental laziness and remorse and all those other things. It's not easy to categorize that in a way. It makes us doubt our situation, our choices. It's literally Mara talking, the evil one, talking to us and trying to pull us back into the sensuality and trying to make us not be liberated. This is a good metaphor to think about it. And synonyms for doubt are all the stories that our mind tells us that we buy into. Is this really for me? Is this even working? I could enjoy myself so much right now. I can't do this anyway. I'm not a meditator. And all kinds of other rationalizations come to mind. The thing is, as those voices happen in our mind, we all automatically pretty much take up the ownership of those voices, and then we act in accordance to that voice that tries to make us act, to Mara. And the Buddha compared it as follows in a simile. Suppose a man with wealth and property were to enter a road across a dangerous desert, and he is uncertain if he would succeed. Later he would cross over the desert, safe and secure, with no loss to his property. Then, on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. Again, a type of relief. You are freed from the oppressive nature of the doubt. This is a scheme of the entire hindrances, and this is what you experience before you enter jhana. And doubt, again, is innate. It is just there. The underlying tendency to doubt is just there. Even if you think about newborns, if you change nothing about the situation and teach them not to doubt, as an example, then doubt will develop. And it is fueled by ignorance and by wrong views and maintained by sensuality. And knowing the harm, as an example, in our behavior would lead to automatically stopping those behaviors. Yet when we doubt that it is really like that, then we can continue. And the only true remedy for doubt is understanding the Dhamma or attaining stream entry. And this is again very important to keep in mind. Stream entry will free you forever from the grip of doubt. Doubtful thoughts can still arise in the mind, but they can touch you no longer. Because again, doubt is felt in the body. And when you have freed yourself to that extent that you no longer think that you are the body, as an example, or you no longer own the body, then you are free from that doubt. And you should seek out wise people and avoid fools. This is a scheme that always applies to any of the hindrances, by the way. The Buddha always advised us to pretty much seek out a sangha of people who are good, who are better than you in certain regards, so that you can imitate them. And you must pretty much postpone your disbelief and put faith in those wise people and believe that there is something to attain. If you don't believe that there is something that you could get out of the good behavior, then you won't do it. It's impossible. If you are completely convinced that something is not beneficial, then you won't do it. And education and understanding can not only really help, but they are essential. Understanding the Dhamma is what frees you from doubt. But yeah, you will basically understand that the doubt was not yours to begin with. And then you can just let it endure in the mind because you know it is beyond me anyway. It arises when it wants to arise. It goes when it wants to go. But it's not me. So it's just there, not bothering you anymore. And experiencing the way to freedom from suffering removes doubt forever. And again, this is very important. All the hindrances are states that are bound up with the body. Even doubt is felt bodily. It does not allow you to sleep at night. It does not allow you to have any nice moment. And freedom from the hindrances is always a relief, a lightness, a feeling of ease, and not orgasmic pleasure. So even overcoming the hindrances is something that is a true relief, something that makes your life much more bearable. Because in essence, what hinders our happiness the most are obstructive things like the hindrances. What remains in Nibbana is perfect peace, perfect contentment, perfect ease, and not orgasmic pleasure. And now we would come to the 4 jhanas in detail. And we were a bit slower today than I would have expected, but this is not a problem. We can do it a bit longer next time. But I will stop here now, as I have talked for nearly an hour now. And next time, we will understand the 4 jhanas in detail, with lots of similes, with lots of citations from the suttas. And it should be crystal clear afterwards why those states are very likely not what you thought they were. But again, the presentation here that I chose is very much in line with all the suttas that I know of, and all the suttas in the Pali Canon, and thus, at least from my opinion, they are very likely true. And that is not something that I would say of many of the other kinds of jhanas. They can help you attain insight, if they are virtue, pretty much. But again, that's not jhana. It's helpful, but not jhana. And it's not good to mix up those things. But anyway, as always, if you have any questions concerning the content that I have presented in this lecture, feel free to ask down below in a new comment, please, so that I can take those questions, write them down. I will answer them immediately, but I will also answer them in a new video at the end of the lecture series, in a Q&A series, to have all kinds of people be able to profit from your questions. Because questions always or very often repeat themselves, because we all have similar wrong views and similar wrong beliefs and similar doubts. So it would be good if you ask your questions when you are doubtful or have some perplexing point, and then everyone can benefit from that. Okay, but I think this is pretty much it for today. Thank you very much for making it till this point in the lecture. If you know anyone who could benefit from such a lecture, or anyone who you could share such a lecture with, feel free to do so. It's not easy to bring people to a good Dhamma, because Dhamma is always a niche interest. It's not super interesting and super shiny as people like to make it. It's not mythical or anything like that, and thus the YouTube algorithm usually does not pick it up. But anyway, thank you again for watching. Have a nice day, and maybe until next time.